Our lives are full of contrast. Night and day. Good
Do the practice exercises.
and bad.
No, just watch the video.
But how do we use the language of contrast? Let's find out. Hey, the language of contrast. If I had to give an award for the most useful grammatical relationship, hands down, I would give it to the language of contrast. However, even though showing contrast is a fundamental writing skill, many students still make mistakes when writing contrast sentences. And that's because there's not just one type of contrast, but three. And that's what we're going to look at in this video. So, are you ready? Let's go. Okay, let's start by looking at these two sentences. I adore pasta. I can't stand pizza. Here we clearly have contrast. I like something and I don't like something. What word could we use to join these sentences? But. I adore pasta, but I can't stand pizza. Simple. A nice compound sentence. The important question though is, how do you feel when you read this sentence? Think about it. Do you feel happy? Do you feel sad? Do you feel surprised? Do you feel disappointed? What do you feel? Nothing. And that's the point. This word but shows neutral contrast. All that but tells me is that here in this sentence we have contrast. Nothing more, nothing less. So the first type of contrast we're looking at today is neutral contrast. To show neutral contrast, we can use but. If you remember in the last video, we can't separate sentences that use but. It makes them informal. However, sometimes in English, we would like to separate two sentences. We want to show contrast, but we want to do it across two sentences, not inside one sentence. So if I wanted to separate these sentences, which would be a bit strange because they are very short, but if I wanted to, I can use a transition signal. Again, don't panic if you don't like grammar. I have got a whole video about transition signals in the essay writing video course. But what's important is that a transition signal allows me to separate these two sentences. So here I could say, I adore pasta, however, I can't stand pizza. However is a transition signal, and however shows me neutral contrast. Simply that these two sentences are not the same. Another transition signal that shows neutral contrast is on the other hand. And the only difference here between but and however, or but and on the other hand, is that now I can separate my two sentences. And that's it. That's all we need to know about neutral contrast. So let's go on to our second type of contrast. Let me tell you about my friend John. John weighs 200 kilograms. So if I tell you this, what do you think about John? Well, you probably think he's a couch potato, or he eats too much fast food. He's a bit lazy. However, let me tell you that John ran a marathon last week. Clearly, there is contrast here. John weighs 200 kilograms. He ran a marathon. These ideas contrast greatly. But again, let me ask you, what do you feel when you read these sentences? I think you should feel surprised because these ideas don't usually go together. So I could join these sentences with but. John weighs 200 kilograms, but he ran a marathon last week. But just shows neutral contrast. It only contains contrast and no surprise. What we want here is a word that includes the surprise. Now, I will give a gold star for any student who can remember from the last video the word yet. Yet does include surprise. John weighs 200 kilograms, yet he ran a marathon last week. If you remembered this word, round of applause, well done. However, you may also remember from the last video, I told you that English people don't really use the word yet. Why? Well, firstly, yet is an old-fashioned word. Secondly, it's a coordinating conjunction, so it can only go in the middle of sentences. And thirdly, we have lots more subordinators that we can use instead of yet. So I wouldn't say, John weighs 200 kilograms, yet he ran a marathon. I would say, although John weighs 200 kilograms, he ran a marathon last week. Although shows me contrast and surprise. When I read although at the beginning of the sentence, I am waiting for the surprise at the end of the sentence. In English, we call words like yet and although that show contrast and surprise concession subordinators. And concession is just contrast and surprise. Again, you don't need to remember the word concession, but you do need to remember that when we use although, the second sentence should be unexpected in some way. Now, although is a subordinator, so this means now we have a complex sentence. So we are free to change the order of our sentences. John ran a marathon last week, although he weighs 200 kilograms. The only difference between these sentences will be, yes, the comma. Now, can you think of other words like although, other subordinators that show this concession relationship? Can you? Well, for this sentence, we could change although to even though or though. Even though John weighs 200 kilograms, he ran a marathon. Though John weighs 200 kilograms, he ran a marathon. More or less, they are exactly the same. Grammar textbooks will tell you that even though shows bigger surprise, and though is only used in spoken English. Therefore, I would forget though. So, even though or although. Now, was anybody out there shouting a different type of word? I'm sure some of you are screaming at your computers, despite. And you are correct. Despite absolutely shows me the relationship of contrast and surprise. However, I cannot simply put despite into this sentence. Despite John weighs 200 kilograms. No, this is grammatically not correct. Because after although or even though, we simply have a clause, a subject and a verb. But after despite, we can never just use a clause. No, 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 no. What can we use? Well, we have got three choices. Choice number one is the easiest, and it's simply adding the three magic words, the fact that. Despite the fact that John weighs 200 kilograms, he ran a marathon last week. This is a good sentence. If you don't have the words the fact that, It's a terrible sentence. My favourite though is not adding the fact that. If you're going to add the fact that, why don't you just use although? My favourite despite sentence is using despite with a verb ing. So if we look at our although sentence, although John weighs 200 kilograms, what's the verb here? Weigh. So we will add an ing and say, despite weighing 200 kilograms, John ran a marathon last week. There is no subject before the verb ing. And that's very important because to use this one, to use the verb ing, you must have the same subject in both sentences. If we change the although sentence to, although John weighs 200 kilograms, his trainer thinks he will win the race next week, now we have two different subjects, John and his trainer. In the although sentence, this is fine. But if I tried to write a despite verb ing sentence here, despite weighing 200 kilograms, his trainer thinks John will win the race next week. Who weighs 200 kilograms? John or his trainer? It's not clear. So even though using the verb ing is my favourite type of despite sentence, you must be careful. Only use it if you have the same subject on both sides. And our third grammar pattern after despite is simply using a noun. No subject, no verb, just a noun. Sometimes it can be very difficult to change a whole sentence into one noun. What would we do here? Although John weighs 200 kilograms, John weighs 200 kilograms. How can I change this into a noun? Maybe just despite his weight, John ran a marathon last week. Here, maybe it doesn't work. But if we had this although sentence, although the weather was bad last week, we went to the beach. Here, I could easily say, despite the bad weather, we went to the beach. It will depend on your first sentence. But never, ever, ever use despite and a clause. Use the fact that, a verb ing, or just a noun. Now, here I've used only despite, but there is another phrase with the same meaning as despite, in spite of. So we could use in spite of in any of these sentences. Please don't use despite of, though. This is where students are confusing despite and in spite of. Only use of with in spite. Now, all of these sentences are telling me the same information, but maybe in the IELTS exam, the despite or in spite of sentences will pay you more points because students naturally write the although sentence and forget the despite sentence. I therefore want to practice all of these sentences now. I am going to show you 4 sentences, and if I give you the although or even though sentence, you need to change it to a despite or in spite sentence, and vice versa. If I give you one of these sentences, you need to change it to an although sentence. So pause the video and write the 4 concession sentences. Okay, how was that? Let's start with the first although sentence. Although most students get well-paid jobs when they leave university, they still have to repay massive student debt. So here we have although plus a clause. If we want to change although to despite, we have got 3 choices. Choice number 1 is the easiest. We can add the magic words, the fact that. despite the fact that most students get well-paid jobs. That's not my favourite option though. My favourite option is the second type of despite sentence. Let's use a verb ing. What's the verb in the first sentence? Get. So we could say, despite getting well-paid jobs when they leave university, students still have to repay massive student loans. Great. What about the noun? Are we able to put all of this information from the first clause into a simple noun? Well, I think probably not. If we try, we end up with a sentence like this: despite the well-paid jobs that they receive. I don't think this is a good idea. It's much better to use an although sentence here rather than trying to make a complicated noun phrase. But these are our three options. Let's move on to question number 2. Even though it has one of the best education systems in the world, England struggles to find good engineers and scientists. Again, we've got even though, and we're changing it to despite or in spite of. So again, we can use our 3 magic words, despite the fact that England has one of the best education systems in the world. Of course, I prefer the verb ing. How do we use that here? Well, what's the verb in this sentence? Has. So do we say hasing? Of course not. We say having, despite having one of the best education systems in the world. And finally, the noun. Again, it's hard to put all of this information into just a noun phrase, but maybe we could say, despite its good education system, England still struggles to find good engineers and scientists. Think carefully when you are using despite and in spite of sentences. Number 3 gave us the opposite type of problem. Here we started with the despite sentence. Despite being bad for our health, fast food is still very popular. So now we need to go backwards. After even though, we need a clause, a subject and a verb. So what's the subject in this sentence? What's bad for our health? Fast food. So even though fast food, now we need the verb. In the despite sentence, I had being. So in this sentence, I will have is. Although fast food is bad for you, it's still very popular. I don't want to use fast food in the second sentence now because I already have it in the first sentence. So let's use it. That's it for this question. There's only one option after although and even though, and that's a clause. And then number 4, in spite of the bad weather, we went for a walk. This one I think is tricky. I think here we will need to say, although the weather was bad, we went for a walk. Notice here that I used the past tense. The weather was bad. This is tricky because in the despite sentence, we don't know the tense of the sentence. We have to find the tense by looking at the second sentence. Here it says went for a walk, so I know I should use the past in the first sentence too. If you found this difficult, don't worry, there are lots more practice activities waiting for you when this video ends. But these sentences all show our second type of contrast, concession. Contrast plus surprise. Because these are complex sentences, we can change the order. Can we separate them though? Can I say, although the weather was bad, stop, we went for a walk? No, of course I can't. That would be a fragment. However, just like we had some transition signals to show neutral contrast, however, and on the other hand, We also have a couple of transition signals that show the relationship of concession. So here I could say, the weather was bad, stop, nevertheless, we went for a walk. Nevertheless shows me contrast and surprise, but it lets me separate the two clauses. The other transition signal you could use here is nonetheless. Nevertheless or nonetheless. These words always go between our two sentences, but now we've got two separate sentences. Great! So now we know how to show two different types of contrast. Let's move on to the third. And our final type of contrast is strong contrast. Words that show the reader the ideas in the two sentences are absolute opposites. For example, now I am standing making this video from my home in Russia. But a few years ago, I didn't live in Russia, I lived in Australia. And for me, Russia and Australia are more or less opposite countries. For example, Russia is cold, Australia is hot. Russia has got a long cultural history. Australia has got a relatively short cultural history. So, hot and cold, long and short, these are absolute opposites. I could make sentences with but doesn't show opposites. Do you know which words show opposites in English? There's while and whereas. While Russia is cold, Australia is hot. Russia has a long cultural history, whereas Australia has a short cultural history. These words can go at the beginning or in the middle of the sentences. But the important thing is that they show me the ideas are absolutely opposite. We couldn't use these words in our John sentences. While John weighs 200 kilograms, he ran a marathon last week, because 200 kilograms and run a marathon are not direct opposites. We could say, while John weighs 200 kilograms, his brother weighs 50 kilograms, because 200 kilograms and 50 kilograms are basically opposites. Or while John ran the marathon last weekend, his brother walked the marathon, because walking and running are opposites. But if you don't have opposites, you can't use while or whereas. The other thing I should say is that in British English, that's my English, sometimes you may see the word whilst. Whilst has got the same meaning as while, it's just old-fashioned English. But English speakers do use it today, so it's useful to be able to recognise it. Now, while, whereas and whilst are subordinators. They create complex sentences. Therefore, we can't separate these clauses. We can't say, while Australia is hot, stop, Russia is cold. Unfortunately, though, we don't have in English any transition signals that we can use to join separate sentences and show strong contrast. So here, if we wanted to separate our sentences, we would have to use however or on the other hand. Australia is hot, stop, however, Russia is cold. All I'll say though is that usually we don't want to separate these sentences. Usually it's enough to contain two clauses inside one sentence. Now, where are we going to use contrast sentences in the exam? The short answer is everywhere. They are so useful. In academic task 1, your best friends are these strong contrast words, while and whereas. And we use them in change charts and compare chart questions to show contrasting trends. While the number of women studying maths increased, the number of men decreased. Increase, decrease. Those are opposites. While the people surveyed were satisfied with the restaurants, they were dissatisfied with the shops. Satisfied, dissatisfied, opposites. As for our essays, well, concession sentences are a vital part of discuss both sides essays. In discuss both sides essays, we usually start our conclusion with although or despite, and then we summarize the main ideas of our essay. Also, we can use although in to what extent essays to distance ourselves from opinions. We will learn to do all of these things in the essay writing course. All you need to know now is that contrast sentences are extremely important because you will use them everywhere. What have we learned in this video? We have learned that there are 3 types of contrast. Neutral contrast, which simply shows contrast and nothing else. Concession, which shows contrast plus surprise. And strong contrast, contrast that shows opposites. And each of these types of contrast are shown by different words. For our neutral contrast, we can use but to join sentences, or we can use however or on the other hand between sentences. The most difficult type of contrast to show, however, is concession, where we have contrast plus some surprise. To show concession, we can use yet, but most of the time we are going to use although or despite. And although and despite both tell the reader, here comes some contrast and surprise, but the grammar we use after these words is very different. After although, we just have a clause, but after despite, we either have the fact that plus a clause, or we have a verb ing, or we have a noun. In terms of grammatical difficulty, the despite or in spite of sentences are more difficult than the although sentences. We also have 2 transition signals to show concession, and those are nevertheless or nonetheless. Finally, we also have some words to show the relationship of strong contrast or opposites. Here we use while or whereas, but if you use these words, make sure your ideas really are opposites. Unfortunately, for our friends strong contrast, there are no transition signals, so we can never separate these sentences. Whew. Okay. That is our relationship of contrast. We will need to write these sentences again and again throughout this writing course. So what you should do now is go and do the practice activities, and then in the next video, we're going to take a break from complex sentences and enter the world of articles. Oh, the fun never ends. I'm Shelley, and this is my IELTS classroom.
Do the practice exercises.
No, just watch the video.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you found the content useful, please click like to help the channel, and don't forget to subscribe for new lessons every Friday. Plus, you can find more expert content at www.myieltsclassroom.com.